So guys, 2 years later, Hell Let Loose is still going strong, and actually the Eastern Front update is just about to drop, which is gonna be the biggest one we've seen yet. And not just that, but with this update, Hell Let Loose is officially gonna be leaving early access as well. So the question is then, is it still worth it? Well guys, this is BillyEatWorld again, and let's find out. Alright guys, how you going? Welcome to the video, and like I said, today we're going back and taking another hard look at Hell Let Loose. And of course, we're going to take a look at some gameplay and everything we know so far about the Eastern Front update. By the way, if you want to skip straight to that, I'll put a timestamp in the description. Now, as I'm recording this video, the update isn't out yet, but you will be able to get your hands on the new Eastern Front content sometime tomorrow. And if you're wondering how I got a hold of this footage, well, it was actually recorded in the PTE. So thanks so much to the guys at Team 17 for giving me permission to share it with you guys. Now, to kick off, I just want to talk to you new guys for a second. If you're new to this game, let's talk about what Hell Let Loose actually is. Because I'm guessing you're probably here because you've heard something like, it's like Squad, or maybe this is what Battlefield 5 should have been, right? But to be honest, look, both of those comparisons come up all the time, but they aren't really fair. Hell Let Loose is more like somewhere in between. And I think 2 years on, that's why it's still actually growing, because on one hand, it is a serious tactical shooter, and on the other hand, it still manages to be pretty accessible for new players. Now, to kind of explain what I mean there, we need to go back and talk about Project Reality, which was actually the game that inspired a lot of these tactical shooters that we see today. And in a nutshell, it was a total conversion mod for Battlefield 2, the whole idea being to make the game even more immersive and realistic and to increase the scale as well. Now, Squad is the spiritual successor to Project Reality, which is why it gets compared to Hell Let Loose and just about every other Project Reality style game. And it makes sense, right? They both have a focus on immersion, they both support up to 100 players in multiplayer, and they both have gigantic maps. Really the big difference though, obviously apart from the fact that this one is set in World War II, is the way that Hell Let Loose treats teamwork. Because Squad, and actually let's lump in the other off-world games in here as well, like Postscriptum, they've been designed so that you pretty much have to work as a team. Now, Hell Let Loose is a lot more forgiving. I mean, it's obviously more effective to work with other players, but even when you're playing solo, you can get stuff done and make a difference in a match. And more than that, it's got a bit more of that pick your own playstyle mentality that people love in games like Battlefield. It doesn't railroad you into playing roles a specific way like a lot of Project Reality style games do. Now, speaking of picking your own play style, I should mention that Hell Let Loose has got a ton of different classes to choose from, and each one has actually got different historically inspired loadouts that you can unlock as well. And these loadouts include not only weapons, but different gadgets, so effectively they're kind of like little mini subclasses that you can choose from. As well as that, you can choose to be a squad leader, and the cool thing about this role is that it allows you to deploy spawn points for your team. And even beyond that, there's a role known as the commander, which has the ability to call in fire support, to deploy vehicles, and to even set up a temporary spawn point behind enemy lines. Now, I also should mention that Hell Let Loose has got a logistics system which some classes can interact with. Supplies, for example, are used to build more permanent team-wide spawn points and fortifications, and you can also build resource nodes to fund commander abilities. And that actually kind of brings me to a really good point of comparison, because if you look at, say, deployables in a game like Battlefield 5, well, they're actually really spongy and almost anyone can take them out. But in Squad, it's the opposite. It's almost impossible for a single player to take down, for example, a HAB. But once again, Hell Let Loose, well, it's somewhere in between. Now, just before we get into the new stuff, the last thing I want to talk about for you new guys, and you've probably figured this out already, is that Hell Let Loose is a combined arms game. Technically. Because look, there's drivable tanks, there's trucks, and there's armored cars, but really that's about it for the moment. All of the aircraft you can see in this video are actually from the commander abilities. Now, apparently half-tracks, jeeps, and assault guns are going to be coming at some point down the track, but no word yet on whether there's going to be player-controlled aircraft. Most probably not. So just bear that in mind. If you are into that sort of thing in your sandbox shooters, well, you're probably not going to get that experience in this game for at least a while, and maybe not ever. Also, another point I should mention is that vehicles operate really differently in Hell Let Loose than they do in games like Battlefield. The main point being, you can't go into third person. And as you can see here, you can literally walk right up and hop on a tank, and they really can't do anything about it. They probably won't even know you're there in the first place. Now, I should mention that infantry players don't really have that many great ways to take out tanks either, so they're kind of safe from you as well. There's dedicated AT roles, but that's really about it. So if you see a tank, unless it's coming right at you, you can pretty much just ignore it. The ones you really have to worry about are the ones hidden off in the distance, covering the objective with their MGs. Now, moving on, so far I haven't really made a big deal of this, but if you've played this game for more than about a year or so, you'll notice that a lot of the features I've just mentioned weren't in the game back then. And you'll also probably remember a time when the maps were a lot more thrown together than they are now. You might not know this, but Hell Let Loose is actually the first game from the devs, Black Matter Studios. And 2 years later, it's pretty obvious they've gotten a lot better at map design, and in almost every major update we've had since then, they've gone back and they've overhauled at least one map. And in this update, they're finally going back and reworking Sainte Marie de Mont, which was actually the very first Hell Let Loose map that was ever released. Now, speaking of maps, one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that the devs actually design maps for Hell Let Loose based on real-world historical locations. They basically take aerial photographs from the war and then they use them as the reference for how they're going to lay out the maps. They even model some of the more important buildings as well. Now, that's really good from an immersion point of view, but if you know anything about game design, you actually probably know that that can get kind of messy in terms of gameplay. And that's where I think Hell Let Loose really hits the nail on the head, much more than a lot of other historical shooters do. They create lanes with strategically placed terrain objects. So in a sense, it becomes almost like a traditional lane-based shooter, except much bigger and with a lot more lanes. Alright, so welcome back to everyone who clicked the timestamp, because we're now going to get on to the Eastern Front update. What does it actually bring to the game? Well, if you're not up to speed with your World War II history, it means the Soviet Union, which is the first new faction that we've seen in the game for over 2 years. Now, obviously, that means we're going to be getting a bunch of Soviet player models and a bunch of new weapons, which you should be seeing on screen right now. And not just that, but we're also going to be getting a set of new Soviet vehicles. And I've got to say, I'm especially keen to try out the T-34. Now, probably one of the few criticisms I've seen in the community so far about this update is that it doesn't look like the devs are going to rework the German faction to suit the time period, because you've got to remember that just about all of the current maps are set in 1944, whereas this update is aimed at mid-1943 at the latest, which doesn't sound like a big difference, but it actually is. A couple of the weapons available to the German team right now just wouldn't have been deployed on the Eastern Front in this period, and the big one that people are worried about is the Panther tank. And admittedly, apparently the devs are making heavy tanks rarer in this update, so that should mean they aren't as common, but it'll be interesting to see if they remove some of those items and the Panther altogether from some of these maps. Now, speaking of maps, let's talk about the two maps we're going to be getting at the launch of the Eastern Front. And in a nutshell, it's going to be Stalingrad and Kursk. And look, both of these battles are pretty well known, but if you haven't heard of them before, well, they're both considered major turning points in World War II. Stalingrad was basically a key industrial city on the Volga River, and it was really important for the Germans to capture it if they wanted to move into the oil fields of the Caucasus region. And Kursk, well, it happened a bit after that. It was the biggest tank battle in human history, and speaking of Panthers, by the way, this was actually the first time they were deployed in the field. Let's talk about the gameplay though, and I've got to say I wasn't really surprised that Kursk was mainly focused around those wide open rolling fields. But Stalingrad though, that was actually kind of surprising. The streets are a lot wider than you think they would be, which is really good for vehicle-on-vehicle combat. Now, there are still a lot of places for the infantry to hide though, especially in bombed out buildings, so you definitely will get that sense of urban combat. And speaking of buildings, well, there's quite a few new building assets being added with this update as well, including some with some really good elevated positions. And that's really good news if you're a fan of sniping. Alright, so just before we finish up, we probably should take a look at some of the gameplay tweaks the devs are going to be making in this update, because like always, there's quite a few. And really, the first of the main ones that I want to talk about is that apparently with the Soviet faction, they're introducing asymmetric balance with the Katyusha rocket barrage. And I know I'm pronouncing that really horribly, probably. Basically, to boil it down, apparently up until this point, the devs have been trying to balance things, especially like the commander abilities, equally, but now they're going to try and include some more unique abilities for each faction. So in a nutshell, it's going to end up more like Insurgency Sandstorm. Each faction will have its own strengths and weaknesses, and it'll be interesting to see how that actually plays out in game. Now also, and this is probably the biggest one I want to talk about, the devs are changing offensive mode, which if you're new to this game is the push mode in Hell Let Loose. The way this game works basically across all of the modes is that maps are divided into sector rows, and each row has a set of predetermined objectives that are randomly selected so that each map feels unique. Now, previously in offensive mode, you had to capture 2 strong points per row to advance, and you had a half an hour for each row to do it, meaning most of the time you had to burn through almost all of that time to get the job done. And that meant games lasting up to 2 hours, which was almost unbearable. So in this update, the devs are reducing the activated strong points per sector row to only 1. That's an amazingly good development. It's probably what's going to get me to actually get back in and play offensive. But anyway, I know this has been a really long video, but bearing all of that in mind, let's get back to the original question, which was, if you remember back till then, is Hell Let Loose actually still worth it after all of this time? Because look, if this was a Battlefield game, we'd be well and truly starting to think about the next one by now, but that's not really how things work with indie shooters. And look, the simple answer to whether or not this is still worth it is, as far as we know, the devs aren't working on the next game yet, and they're still committed to future content for this one. So if you were to buy it right now, you'd be guaranteed of at least a couple of years worth of continued support. And not just that, but here's the big thing, people are still playing it, and like I said, the player base is only growing. Actually, to be honest, I think this is going to be a really big year for Hell Let Loose. This update is obviously going to be massive on its own, and it's going to increase the player base a lot. But one thing we haven't mentioned yet is that Hell Let Loose is coming to console apparently sometime later this year, if you actually trust that forecast. And that is going to make an even bigger impact. Now, even putting that aside though, the big reason I still think this game is worth it though is because of the dev team. Like I said, Hell Let Loose is Black Matter's very first game. And man, the fact that people even speak its name in the same breath as AAA shooters like Battlefield's means that Hell Let Loose has achieved more than almost any other indie shooter could ever hope to. But anyway, guys, that just about wraps up this quick review. So as always, if you like what you see, please remember to leave a comment down below and hit that like button. And just remember that I can't possibly cover every little detail in one video. So I'm gonna miss stuff. If you think I have, please put it in the comments so that everyone else can actually read it as well. As always though, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and check out the links on screen now and in the description if you want to check out any more of my videos. And also don't forget you can find my Twitter and Discord links down there as well if you want to keep in touch. And until next time, see you later and have a good one.